All right, we are live. Let me just check my mic settings. Okay, we're in good shape there. So you are live with 100 Centuries. My name is Connie B. Dowell, and Stephen Dowell unfortunately couldn't be here for this interview. But today we are interviewing author Leigh, rather I am interviewing author Leigh Shearin when she arrives. So her invitation has been sent out and she should be here shortly.
I'm so sorry. I can see you. Can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you. Were you able to see me the whole time?
No, I'm not sure what I was doing wrong. I saw the invitation, but I couldn't seem to, I kept clicking on it and I couldn't seem to make the connection.
Okay, well, whatever you did last, and I guess it worked. I'm sorry about the delay in getting things hooked up here, but I'm glad that we got you online.
Me too.
All right, well, welcome to 100 Centuries, and thank you so much for coming on the show. So would you like to tell our listeners, or rather listeners in the future, a little bit about yourself and your book?
Well, my name's Leigh Shearin, and I am a farmer and a baker, and my business is food, and I love history, and so I wrote this book a few years ago, and it's all about World War II and the home front, and the amazing things that people did with almost nothing.
Okay. So for those who aren't familiar with the book, could you tell a little bit about the title and the plot and where to find it?
Yeah, the title is John Bloom and the Victory Garden, and it's available on Amazon. It's an ebook right now, instantly downloadable on Kindle or any other device. And it's part one. Part two is coming out in October. And it is a homefront story about three little boys and a very old grumpy man, and all the adventures they get into.
All right. So what drew you to this period specifically and researching Victory Gardens?
Well, actually, the idea came from my father. My father's name is John Bloom Emery, and my parents raised us, my sister and I, both garden with gardens and gardening, and it just popped into my head one day. I've always loved gardening. Obviously, I'm a farmer now, so we grow vegetable crops and fish and chickens and pigs and all the farm stuff. And I've always been drawn to World War II just because it was such a time of selflessness. I mean, people back then, they didn't focus on themselves. They really focused on the greater good and didn't focus on what they couldn't do. Rather, they focused on what they could do. And that's a huge attraction to me because it's really just reiterates how much you can do with the spirit, that can-do spirit, if we all work together. And that is sort of the theme of the books, both of them, is not just the specific garden or gardening or food. It's really working together and becoming victorious through the collective effort.
Okay. So I think a lot of listeners probably know about the concepts of Victory Gardens throughout World War II and World War I. But could you talk a little bit about their importance? How did that change how people lived and how people ate and cooked?
Well, probably the biggest point of Victory Gardens is that the commercial farmers of the time had to send their crops and their harvests directly to the troops, to the Allies, on, the Americans, the English, the French, everybody fighting against the Axis powers had to be fed. So all of the commercial crops would go straight to the U.S. War Department, to the British and all the European fighters. And so people in America still had to eat. And at the time, it was a really, our society was very agrarian. Most people lived on farms. But there were a few people that lived in cities. And so when the War Department asked Americans to start in World War I and II, start growing their own vegetables, growing their own flocks of chickens, which were called victory flocks, that was a key component to winning this tremendous war. Was everybody pitched in, everybody, little kids, women, old men, everybody. And so if everybody was growing their own crops at home, then that extra food could be used to feed the mass troops. But what it did was it pulled everybody together. It pulled villages together, cities together. Far-flung ranchers were working towards the greater good. Everybody had a victory garden. Everybody was doing scrap drives. Everybody was working in whatever way they could to win that war.
Wow, great. Yeah, definitely a time of kind of togetherness and collective action for this country and for many countries. So John Bloom and the Victory Garden, it's a children's book. It looked like about chapter book length. Without giving too much plot away, what's kind of the main conflict going on with this story?
Well, the biggest conflict is the main character is John Bloom, and he's a 10-year-old, and he wants to be a good kid, but he still wants to be a cool kid, and he's sort of walking that tightrope between being his mother's son and being his friend's friend. His friends are pretty mischievous, and they like to get into trouble. They are also good and bad, just like any kid and any human being. There's good sides of us and bad sides of us, and sometimes the good wins out, sometimes the bad wins out. And but the main conflict is trying to do the best job you can do, and still being a human being. We all have our weaknesses, and we all have grumpy days, and we all have good days. And so it's really an effort to show kids that they can be kids, and they can be foolish and mischievous and mean sometimes, but it doesn't make them bad people. If they're working for the greater good, if they're working towards something that's worthwhile and important, then they have a place in this world.
All right. So what drew you to writing specifically for children, or for that age group in particular?
Well, I think the first thing, it's evolved. It's been, as they say, an organic process. It started out because I had, we're still raising kids, my husband and I, but we had 3 boys and 1 girl. And 10, 15 years ago, as the boys were young, there weren't a lot of books out there for boys that weren't about dragons or, wizards and warlocks. We all know about that story. That's a wonderful story, and I love it. But there just wasn't a lot of interesting historical material for boys that wasn't either a picture book or sort of a Johnny Tremain, serious history kind of. I wanted it to be lighthearted and teach a little something, but still just be fun for the younger boys to read. But then, as I was writing it, I really just drew on day in and day out kid raising. The stuff that the kids would get into was just like, I thought, I just have to write this down because I can't even make this stuff up. It's so good. Most of it really happened. Everything that's in the book basically did happen in one form or another. So but as I wrote the book, I thought, you know what, we need to write this for just everybody. I just want to write a good story for everybody, boys, girls, old, young. And then Mr. Hutchins crept in, and Mr. Hutchins is 98 years old, very grumpy, lives alone, and so I tried to like weave in a little bit the generational gap between the young and the old and sort of everybody in between. And really my biggest goal was to just write a good story about history that would inspire people in this very kind of rough and mean, scary world that we live in today, that bad times have happened in the past and we can overcome them if we just work together.
Yeah, a very good, important message. And it's really interesting to think about that generational gap and dealing with it, because that's a pretty huge one from
Yeah.
Kids that are elementary school age to someone nearly 100. And at that time, when you go backwards and think about it, he would have been born in the 1840s and had a very different life experience.
Yes, he was involved in a lot of adventures himself, and I'm thinking about spinning that off into another story as well about Mr. Hutchins. So, he's just a really interesting guy. He's lived a long time, and he doesn't have a lot of patience for a lot of nonsense, but he has a sense of humor too. So, yeah, and he saw a lot of history as well. So, yeah, good character.
Okay. So is there anything you'd like to share about the research process, things that surprised you or challenged you, or how you got kind of started?
Well, it's funny because when I first started, it's been almost 6 years ago. This has been a really long process. And I don't use an outline or any kind of things on the wall or pictures or anything. I really just write what I see. The story comes alive in my mind, and I just sit there and I type. I watch what I see, and I just write it. So it is a long process, which, doing it that way, I have to go back and correct and revise and all that. But when I first started writing this, the internet was good, but it was 2008 or so. So there was still a lot of stuff I had to get books out, actual books, covers, paper, and look stuff up, make sure my facts are right, because a lot of the story revolves around newspaper headlines, key things. The book starts out in chapter 1, starts out with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and I want kids to see those headlines that were real, so it makes it more dramatic for them, because that stuff was shocking for the people at the time. And so a lot of my research was World War II history sites, U.S. War Department archive data, kind of dry stuff really, but the exciting thing of it is that it all really happened. It all really happened, and we don't hear about that. We hear, oh, the greatest generation. Well, what does that mean? The greatest generation didn't just save us from like just unbelievable evil. They took sticks and canvas and made airplanes out of them. They literally dropped bombs out from a trap door that was between their feet. Maybe not literally, but very close to that. They pulled off miracles with nothing, and they weren't soldiers. They were postmen and carpenters and farmers and lumberjacks that were looking for adventure, and they found it. So yeah, I want people to remember that you can do anything in the world with absolutely nothing if you just work together and put your mind to it.
Yeah, that's really neat to have actual historical headlines in there. It's really interesting to see. In my own research, I've been looking at lots and lots of digitized newspapers that Of course, not everything is available digitally, but you can get quite a lot. It's a really good teaching tool and a really good research tool to see all those old newspapers and what's happening day to day. So, is there anything you'd like to share about the publication process or the book production process that was really interesting for you?
Well, I have to say it was frustrating for me at first because, I've heard stories, I've read books my whole life. I'm a huge book reader and book fan. And I've heard stories kind of all my life of, for instance, Beatrix Potter, classic story. A passionate artist and storyteller with her pages and wrapped in twine and walks from publisher to publisher. And all of a sudden, she comes on, and I know it wasn't easy for her either, but she seemed to find pretty quick success. And so I was thinking that was going to be the same thing for me. And it really wasn't. It was a little off-putting, I have to say, trying to find an agent, trying to find a publisher. And it did kind of, to be honest, it did really stifle my creative process for a little while. And then I just said, I'm just going to write this story, and whoever wants to read it can read it. And over that period of time, I discovered the independent author process and self-publishing. Thank you, Amazon.com. We love you, we independent authors. And so I went ahead and tackled all my fear of technology and wrote the book and had it formatted. And my lovely sister-in-law handles all my artwork and all my formatting, and Dogstar Creative Services. And just uploaded it to Amazon, and Bob was my uncle. It was done. So now it's just the marketing, and I'd love to have a publisher pick it up someday. I would love that. But I've sort of set that on the side. If nobody picks it up, that's fine. Just because I love the writing, I love the characters, and I love the town, and I love the townspeople, and I just want to play with them. I just want to move them through the Second World War and see what they do and see what they say. And we're in the second half right now. I'm in the process of putting forward part 2, which is called Digging In. And in that book, we get more to the gardening, more to the actual hands-on. The first book is more learning about the characters, seeing what their sort of motivation is. Each kid has a different sort of interesting dynamic with the other kid and the other townspeople and their parents. Their parents are out there somewhere. And so Digging In is more about the actual work of making a victory garden. And 1942 was tough. And so that's sort of my motivation for calling it Digging In, John Bloom and the Victory Garden Digging In, because really everybody in the whole world was digging in. The Soviets were digging in. The Germans, of course, were really digging in. And, the Japanese were absolutely unstoppable. And the Japanese owned the Pacific region. I mean, they sank everything. They were just taking island after island after island. And that was really a depressing time for Americans and for all the Allies, because the Japanese just seemed like they were unstoppable. So it was a time where people really did have to dig in and just dig deep and just stay strong. And there was a lot going on in that part of 1942. The weather was terrible. It was hot. It was cold. There were storms. It was a lot like today. People call it global warming, but it's happened before. Weird weather happens. No comment on all that, but the weather didn't cooperate. It was just a really bad year.
Yeah. Well, I love the title, Digging In. When do you anticipate that coming out?
That is coming out in October. So, God willing and the creeks don't rise. But October is right about where I'm hoping to get it out. There's a bit about, Halloween, and I do try to bring that up. Holidays during the war for kids, especially. You know, holidays still happened. There was still holidays. There was still Halloween. There was still Thanksgiving, Christmas, and people made the best of things. So I like to. I don't know. There's just a lot of kids in today's world that have it hard, you know, and I like to try to give them something to comfort them and say, you know, we're having a hard time, but look at these kids back during World War II. You know, it was terrible, terrible, terrible time. They didn't even have enough to eat, and they still had Halloween. They still had Christmas. They still did everything, or they tried to anyway. And I hope that brings somebody in the world some comfort. So October is when it comes out, and we'll see what happens in the next installment after that.
All right. Well, that sounds, awesome. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the period, about your book?
Well, I tell you, I have absolutely nothing but respect for that generation. But I also really, the time period was that people just didn't give up. They, in fact, I just read an article recently about how there was no gasoline. Everything was rationed at that time. And in digging in, we get more into rationing and ration tickets, ration books and coupons and things. And but people would build furnaces in the back of their car and run pipes around the outside of their car or over the top or whatever, and they would run their cars off of steam. And I want to say that was called a gasifier. And there are pictures on the internet of the gasifiers, how people would just, it wasn't very attractive, you know, there was a huge furnace behind your car and a big, huge pipe running around the side to the front to the engine. But, you know, they didn't complain about stuff. They just fixed it. You know, they didn't whine, they didn't cry, they didn't wring their hands and gnash their teeth. They just figured out how to make it work, and they made it work. And it wasn't pretty, probably most of the time, but it still worked, still got them to where they needed to go. And that sense of kind of can-do spirit, you know, I think we've lost that, and to some extent. And I would love to see more of that come back, especially to the younger generation, of just kind of, don't complain about it. Don't cry about it. I mean, you can cry if you want to, but then wipe your tears and pull your boots up and let's figure it out. So, you know, I have huge respect for that generation and previous generations as well. I don't discount them either. But I'd love to see that sense of, let's just do it, back in our society. And maybe it won't come, maybe it will, but at least people will know that it is possible.
Yeah. Great message. So I love hearing about the gasifier. I've never heard of that before, but it sounds really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll probably show up in the third book somewhere along the way. They're very interested as the year ticks along in the launching of the USS New Jersey, which launched out of Philadelphia. It was the biggest warship ever created. And my father's actually from New Jersey, so this part of this is motivation. You know, my family does come from the area. And Appleside is the town, and it's actually completely modeled after a real life town in New Jersey called Pittman, New Jersey. And Pittman was where my father grew up, and there's a lot of history going on in Pittman. And so, you know, the boys are very interested in the next battleship to be launched, and I'm thinking maybe they might have to drive to Philadelphia in a gasified truck.
Oh yeah, you've got to put a gasifier in. That needs to be in a book. All right. Well, thank you again so much for coming on the show. So we know that our readers can find your first book on Amazon. Is there any place else that they should find you online?
Well, you can look for me at leigh.shearin.weebly.com. I am on Twitter at Leigh Shearin. I'm also on Instagram as Winter Rest Farm. But if you just go to leigh.shearin.weebly.com, all my contact information is there, and you can send me an email if you can't figure it out, and I will take you by the hand and I will show you where to go.
All right. Well, thank you again for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. And sorry about the kind of rocky start, but I think this has turned out pretty good.
Thanks for your patience. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, I think we are about wrapped up, so I'll stop the broadcast and say good evening.
Okay, Connie. Thanks. Take care.
All right. You too.
Bye.